The Council of Europe has just published policy guidelines concerning the protection of children whose parents are in prison. How many children are we talking about in Europe?
We're talking about 2 million children in Europe, which is quite a staggering number. And when we started this work, many of our interlocutors and partners hadn't realized that so many people were concerned. I must say this is an estimate made by NGOs. There are no government statistics on this, but there are a number of NGOs very active in this field throughout Europe. And their combined guess is that we're talking about 2 million children who at any point in time have one or sometimes both parents in prison.
But why is it that the Committee of Ministers then of the Council of Europe have decided that it's important enough to come out with guidelines?
First of all, because the Council of Europe, dealing with human rights, has for a number of years now made the situation of children one of its priorities, the human rights of children, children being one of the most vulnerable groups in society. And we have been working for a long time in the prison field. Putting these things together, we realized that the situation of children who have one or two parents in prison in most countries was terribly neglected, sadly. The issue came up at a conference of directors of prison administration 2 years ago, and by an individual prison director who explained what he had done, the problems he had faced, and then a number of NGOs who made a presentation, in particular COPE, which is a network which deals with this issue. And the situation is actually quite dramatic, because in a lot of countries, once a parent is taken into custody, the children's immediate basic needs are taken care of. The child is fed, housed, if the parent is the sole caretaker, or if both parents are arrested. But then no thought is given to what happens to a child who suddenly finds himself with mummy or daddy behind bars.
But the recommendations were made to 47 countries at the European level. Why is it at that level that action has to be taken? Why is it not at the national level?
Well, we hope that the aim of the guidelines is to guide member states to improve their policies on this, on the basis of best practice. These guidelines weren't invented in an office here in Strasbourg. They're the result of discussions between practitioners, people who actually run prisons and prison administrations. And we found that although, as I said earlier, the issue had been much neglected, sadly, in Europe as a whole, there are cases of very good practice in a number of countries, and we have used these to base the guidelines on, to help our governments to come to more sensible and more child-friendly.
Can you give an idea of which countries have been leading in the area?
Some of the Nordic countries have been very good. Italy has a very active NGO, which is called Bambini Senza Sbarre, meaning children without bars, which has a formal agreement with the Ministry of Justice. So that was actually one of the examples to follow. And Switzerland has been experimenting with a number of good practices.
And the guidelines come out in the form of a recommendation. The Committee of Ministers makes recommendations to member states.
Yes.
But what kind of legal force do they have?
The recommendation as such doesn't have, it's not a treaty, so it doesn't have to be ratified. It doesn't have the force of law. But it was unanimously adopted, which means that it represents the consensus of 47 governments who all agree on this. They agreed at technical level, but also agreed at the political level in the Committee of Ministers. And what we've seen more and more in recent years is that the European Court of Human Rights, when interpreting the European Convention, and for instance, Article 8, the right to family life, is relevant in this context, very often uses recommendations of the Committee of Ministers for its legal findings. So in a way, via backdoor, recommendations can obtain force of law or virtually force of law.
And are we talking about special rights, special interests of children simply because their parents are in prison?
No, it's simply to ensure that the dignity and the rights that any child should have are respected. Namely, that a child should be able to see his mummy or daddy, to put it simple, to maintain a relationship with a parent, a child-parent relationship, even if the parent is detained. And that requires a number of considerations, such as right to access, enabling the child to visit the prison. If visiting hours are only during school hours, for instance, that already makes it very difficult. To give you a practical example, if the parent in bigger countries is detained 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers from the residence of the child, that makes it very difficult. And there are, if the facilities in the prison do not make it possible for children to actually enter, but they will be searched in an aggressive way. They'll be actually put in a room a locked room themselves. All of this can make it very difficult. So these are the issues we're looking at.
And the guidelines then are actually addressed not just to member states, but also to prisons, to prison authorities.
Absolutely. I mean, the recommendation is addressed to member states, but the measures included in the guidelines very much apply to prison managers, prison directors, also very much to prison staff. And one of the issues highlighted is the need for training prison staff. That they also have to be able to deal with children who are coming to see any prison parent, and not just with detained people.
And in the recommendation, I noticed the use of the phrase child sensitive,
yes.
that things should be done in a child sensitive way, whether it's arrests or whatever.
Yeah.
Can you give a little bit of a description of what that means?
Yes, it means that insofar as possible, the interest of the child, the best interest of the child should be taken into account. When a parent is arrested, if that happens at night in the home, that may be inevitable, but we recommend that care should be taken of the children who witness that, who are traumatized by that. That's one example. Another example is when children visit prisons, that there is a room where children can feel more or less at ease. That can often be very simply done. A few Disney posters, a few fluffy animals, an area where a child can feel relaxed before visiting or meeting with the parent.
So less institutional, more familiar.
Yes, and simply taking into account that when you're 3 or 4 years old, prison is a very intimidating place anyway for anyone who's ever visited a prison.
And it's not the children who've committed the crime.
And it's not the children who've committed the crime, so they should not pay for their parents' crime. And when they then visit the prison, and it doesn't cost much. To have a little space in prison where a child can feel more or less at ease or reassured is often very easily arranged, but it has to be thought of.
Are we nevertheless talking about a certain type of parent here, though? Are we not talking about children of parents who are in prison because they've committed certain types of crime? Presumably, if one of the parents is a mass murderer, that would make it harder to implement the recommendation in the same way.
Of course, clearly. It's always the interest of the child that is the starting point. And of course, there are also parents who are in prison because they abuse their children. Obviously, these are not the cases we're thinking of. But in most cases, most of these 2 million children do not have a mass murderer parent in prison. The parents are in prison for all sorts of reasons. And in most cases, it's in the child's interest to enable the child to maintain the relationship, which is essential for his or her development. And there is a lot to suggest that it also helps the offender to the rehabilitation of the offender during the prison serving the prison sentence, and also making it easy to return to society.
Because of the contact with the child?
Absolutely, maintaining a family relationship.
Presumably the role of law enforcement officers and prison staff is important in this. What recommendations has the Council of Europe addressed to them?
It is good prison management. A well-run prison is in itself a very important step towards child-friendly justice and child-friendly measures. Secondly, training, of which I already mentioned a moment ago, that prison staff is simply made aware. They may, of course, they're used to doing very rigorous body searches, but if you have a 6-year-old child.
So it's specialized training.
Exactly, yes. And in fact, the recommendation, for instance, that invasive body searches should be prohibited, full stop, for children.
But again, that would limit the kind of contacts with the kinds of people who are in
prison.
Yes,
for certain kinds of crime. But for this 2 million, as I said, fortunately, we don't have 2 million mass murderers in prison in Europe. So it's for most of what I would say the ordinary prisoners. And where there are and of course, it's always the interest of the child. If there are indications from the social services, the prison services, the magistrates, judiciary that would argue against the contact, that of course would prevail, be taken into account. But in most cases, a good, normal relationship, as far as possible, of course, under the circumstances, is in the interest of the child, of the offender, and of society.
Is this partly a question of money?
No, as I mentioned earlier, for instance, a very important aspect is the way prison staff treat the children. Okay. That needs training. Well, perhaps it needs money in the sense that you need to have a little training, but you don't need 6 months of training for that either. To have a little room, a little space where children can feel more at home than in a concrete cell. Simply an awareness that children have particular needs. And then, of course, that's for the individual prison and for the prison management, of course, when prisoners are placed in a certain prison. Especially in the larger countries, to take into account that if the prisoner has children, that should be a factor to be taken into account. For instance, what we've also asked, because we realize that most prisons, or that most prisons, perhaps not many prisons, don't do that, is to register when they have inmates coming, whether these prisoners have children, how old they are, where they live, so to take this into account when managing the prison population.
And who should be responsible for monitoring whether or not children's rights and interests are being respected?
Well, we have, of course, as I said, the recommendations are of the Committee of Ministers are taken into account by the European Court of Human Rights, but that's ex post. We have a number of specialized expert bodies in the Council of Europe, such as the body that elaborated this text, dealing with prison matters, and that's a peer-to-peer, member states amongst themselves, and we certainly will follow the implementation of this recommendation very closely at regular intervals. We're also pleading very strongly for it to be translated, because of course, as you rightly asked, who is it addressed to? It's also addressed to prison staff, to individual prison managers, prison directors, and of course not all of them in Europe speak fluent English or French or read it, so it's very important that our member states help us to translate this recommendation into the national languages so that it can really be of use to the people on the ground.